Well, what a delight and an honour it is to have Roger with us this morning. Roger Walton, good morning to you.
Morning.
How are you?
I'm well, thank you. Yes, I am.
Roger, you're speaking to us today as we begin our fuller look at Methodist Way of Life. We introduced it, as you know, just after Covenant Sunday in January, just a sort of an introductory few weeks, but now we're starting to go through each section in much more detail. You've been involved with Methodist Way of Life from the beginning, really. I wondered what it was about this rhythm of life that really attracted you to it, and you've given a lot of your time and energy to it. So what is it about it that makes you believe it's worth us studying and looking at and using?
Well, in terms of where it's come from, it's got a few tributaries like any kind of river, really. And we'd have to go back to the year 2000 when Methodist Church accepted our calling as the sort of sense of what our church needed to be in the 21st century. And I, like many others, very excited about our calling. I thought it was focused, it was rounded, and I think churches across the country thought this is good stuff. This helps us to focus our energies. But I was working in the Northeast at the time, as at the Theological College, and a number of people came along and said, we really like this, but we'd love to be able to translate it into everyday practical living, into our discipleship. So I worked with one church in particular, and we drew up some questions that people could ask each other around the 4 areas of our calling, just to check how people were getting on and to help each other and to pray for each other and so on. And they developed a series of small groups, usually only 3 or 4 people in a group. And they were meeting now, this is back in the day, so they could meet in a coffee shop or somewhere like that. and so
my word.
they were meeting up regularly and usually just kind of focusing in on one of these questions or one area, and sharing with each other, praying for each other and so on, meeting maybe fortnightly. I got a bit of an insight because my wife was involved in one of the groups, and although she didn't tell me the content, she said, this works, it helps us as we're going along. So that was a kind of piece of work, and it was related to that our calling began to re-emerge a bit later. So we're all recognizing that the landscape around us is changing. I mean, it's been changing long before COVID, and it's going to change again. And the sort of relationship between wider society and culture and the church is shifting quite dramatically. Kind of at one time, I guess, we would have said we were a Christian country, not that everybody was Christian, but that the kind of state helped the church tell people how to be Christian. So, there was no shopping on a Sunday at one stage. And, even if you didn't go to church, and my family didn't go to church when I was younger, you knew that was something to do with being Christian, going to church on a Sunday. But of course, that's gone by and large. And the holidays that we had were the holy days: Easter, Christmas, Pentecost. And gradually they've begun to disappear too. So people hang on to Christmas because it's very commercial, and Easter because it's Easter bunnies and Easter eggs sold a lot. But outside the church, who knows where Pentecost is? Or even if you use the term Whitsuntide, which would have been in common parlance 50 years ago, people wouldn't know now. So we've got a changing situation, and I began to get interested in how the church was responding in many different places to that change. And I suppose it became focused around the notion of new monasticism. So people looking to the old monastic communities, which were extraordinary communities, that began in the 4th century and were the powerhouse of Christian mission for over 1,000 years, really. Many of them lived by a rule of life. And one of the things that people began to get interested in a few years back now was, what would that be like? To help us focus as Christians on the really important things that keep us connected to God in Jesus, and help us to live out the Christian way. And so I got quite interested in that, and I noticed that that some of the new communities that were starting in North America and in the UK were focusing in on this and using a rule of life.
Yeah.
And so I began to kind of read around it. And I thought, well, this is not a million miles away from what we were doing in the Northeast, but it's something that people kind of accept and say, this is our way of life and commit to. And so I began to play around with what it might look like. Actually, it was an academic conference. I presented a paper saying, what would it look like if Methodists had a rule of life? And it was well received. So it didn't mean anything anywhere else, but it was well received in the conference, and I carried on working on it, and then bumped into the connectional secretary at one of the chairs meetings, and I said, I've just been playing about with this, and I wonder whether this is of any use. Well, the connectional secretary got very, very excited and said, can I take this away with me? Anyway, that's how it got into the kind of bloodstream of the method. As we were reaffirming our calling, it became an integral part of it. And a group this was then set up by the connectional team for some work to be done on it. And we did that work over the last couple of years.
Yes. It is as interesting as you say, that rediscovery of monasticism, or a new monasticism, and people wanting to gather around a rhythm, a pattern of life, a way of living, a rule of life. It's been an interesting year to roll it out. All the resources have been coming out to us, and the context has been a bit different. So I wondered, Roger, what sort of good news stories have you heard that might actually be quite different to what you'd expected, or have some of the things you'd expected begun to happen?
Well, we had planned a big launch at conference. The president was going to lead on it. There was going to be a big rollout in the September through the synods, and none of that happened because of COVID. So we made it available, and then gradually resources have been added, as you say, and people have been receiving them and exploring them. One of the things I think COVID has done is it's allowed us to explore how we could be church differently. So a year ago, nobody knew what Zoom was unless you were in high finance and having these meetings. And now all of us do it. YouTube videos are many now. You can have services 24 hours a day because they're there on YouTube. We've been exploring how to be church in a very different situation. Yeah. And some new things have emerged from that, which I think are very exciting. I mean, one of them has been the number of places where daily prayer has become normal. Where the church has put somebody on each day to offer some prayers and some leaning prayers, and lots of people have tuned in to share in that daily prayer. Now, I think that's really quite powerful. I think we're rediscovering what prayer is about and how in a daily way we can be connected to each other and connected to God. Yeah. And I think that's been very rich. And I think that it's given some have given the label of Methodist Way of Life to their daily prayers, and invited people in to pray, and then, as well as praying, invited them to look at the commitments and the questions for their own growth, and I think it's meant that people, surprising groups, have emerged. So in the northeast of England. This is not connected with the year 2000, but in the northeast of England, they've set up regular meetings for ministers online. So the ministers meet, and when they meet, they go into small groups and they tackle one of the questions in Way of Life. And it's sort of, in a sense, been quite refreshing to discover that ministers, found this helpful. Safe spaces to talk about their own personal discipleship, because they're often up front leading other people. It's not always easy to say, actually, I'm having a difficult time, or I've discovered this wonderful thing. They've been meeting together, and that's been really good. And I think one of the best stories is what is known as Metal Methodist Way of Life.
Okay.
Okay. Now, this is James Morley, who's one of the superintendents in Sheffield. And in his youth, I mean, I think he would still see himself as young, but in his youth, he was a metalhead. He was into metal music, so heavy metal was his thing. And I don't think that was always well received when he went to church, with his T-shirts and his studs and so on. And he's been a Methodist minister for some time, superintendent there, and he had a sabbatical, which kind of coincided a bit with the launch of Methodist Way of Life, and he decided he would do two things in his sabbatical. He would reconnect with heavy metal, and he would explore this, and he set up a daily set of praying and conversation morning and evening, which is called Methodist Way of Life. And he invited anybody who was into heavy metal to join this, and a few people locally joined. But what's been really interesting is that people all over the country and all over Europe have tuned into this, because many people who find that music really attractive and helpful have not always found an easy kind of place for it in the life of the church. So he has quite a gathering now, and I went to it one evening, and I thought, am I going to really like this? And actually the music was so much better than I imagined. It was quite enjoyable, really. But what was significant was they were using the questions for people to talk, and the night I was there, it was about sharing your faith with others. And they had somebody who kind of gave a sort of testimony, talked about how that had been in their life, and then everybody else joined in, whether they were on the Facebook or other medium. It was going out through several mediums, yeah. and people contributed, and it's become almost an evangelistic thing. It's drawn other people into the life of discipleship. So quite some very exciting things, really.
That's incredibly exciting. And I suppose you provide a framework, but people can be as creative as they want to be.
Absolutely.
With the questions. So we're doing this series over the next few weeks, and as well as focusing it on a Sunday, which is a big and an important day, there will be bits and pieces throughout the week as well. But essentially, it works best if people are in small groups. You mentioned actually fairly small groups, 3 or 4, not 6 or 10, or a smaller group of people. For those who are listening, Roger, who maybe have never been part of a group like that and maybe find that a little bit daunting, can you break it down and simplify it? What are the essential? I mean, presumably a few friends who are in church together, who maybe already regularly talk on the telephone. I mean, you've mentioned COVID has given us, or this year has given us, some additional tools, which maybe for some people makes communication easier from home rather than having to go anywhere. But can you break it down into, how would somebody get started?
Okay, what you say is really helpful, Phil. I mean, I think that it's worked well where people have met in small groups. So this is not house group size. It's not 8 to 12. It's often 3 or 4, and it's often started with people who have a friendship or someone they trust a bit. So they got going in that kind of way, and 3 or 4 people then regularly. Now during the COVID period, most people have done that through Skype or Zoom or similar, or a telephone conversation. But I think prior to that, when it was being piloted, lots of people met in these small groups regularly, and I think that what the Methodist Way of Life gives is a structure for a conversation, and it's a conversation about God and how God is at work. Now, I think for lots and lots of people, there is no such structure. That the people are in church on Sunday, they hear about God, they seek to respond to God, but there's not often a place where people can talk a little bit about their experience, and it gives a structure for doing that. So the questions are a good way of doing it. You wouldn't expect people to work their way through all the questions on one meeting. You might take one question or one section and each person share a little bit from where they are. And what's important is there are no right answers in this. There's just authentic, honest conversation, which sometimes means when people are talking about prayer, somebody says, actually, I find prayer really difficult and I can't pray at the moment. And there's something really authentic and good about that, which expresses it not only to those who are in the small group, but you're expressing it to God and say, this is where I am. And sometimes other people can help you along, say, I found this helpful or whatever, or they just simply alongside you when you're struggling, and that's fine. And sometimes you've got things to say that you didn't know you had to say, and you pose a question, where have you seen God recently, for example? If you look from the outside and you don't do that regularly, you think, oh, I could not possibly part of that. But my experience is that when people are in a group where there's some trust and people begin to share a little, everybody's got a story. Everybody knows something about God. But the thing is, in Methodism, I have to say this is rather sad, I think we've lost the art of doing that, of telling each other where we saw God, where we sensed God. That might have been something beautiful we've seen in some relationship, something we've heard, the Bible that we've read. It could be anything, but it's surprising how much God is present to every single one of us. And gradually our eyes open and we can share that. And I think to start in a small group. Now, I think the groups ought not to last for a long time. This ought not to be a 3-hour meeting. You might meet for an hour once a fortnight, something like that. But you kind of deliberately set it aside. You don't make it just part of you. Well, we'll have a conversation next time we're together. You actually set it aside, and it gives you a structure and it gives you some questions, and you can begin to have this conversation about God. And we had an interview. We had a webinar for about 200 local preachers this last week. And we had an interview with somebody who's been doing this in her church. She, her name was Mareka, and she's a worship leader. And when all this began to happen, and she saw Methodist Way of Life, she started meeting with the stewards in her church on Zoom as it went fairly quickly, and just working their way through the questions. And what she was saying, which was just astounding, was not only had they got confident in talking to each other, but it had a kind of outward focus. They were saying, well, we can't go in our building, but we have a big wall next to our building. We can put things on that wall. We can, put encouraging notices. We can put good pictures. We can, and they've begun to see mission in a new kind of way. So it isn't just a personal encouragement. It's a kind of springboard into the life of mission. So I think if you're starting to explore this in the preaching series, it would be really good for people to experiment with groups of 3 or 4 and to use that. And sometimes when you come together, something else will focus the agenda. What Phil said on Sunday or whatever it is, something will focus the agenda, and that's fine. But the questions will continue to be there for you to explore. The other thing that I found quite interesting when we were piloting this, there was one group in Burley that had a series of house groups, and they studied all sorts of different things. They didn't focus in on Methodist Way of Life particularly, but they used it at the end of every meeting to say together. So they said the commitments as they'd finished whatever it was they were doing, as they went out into their everyday lives. This is the kind of people we are going to be able to proclaim the kingdom of God. And I think there are a variety of ways of nurturing that in smaller and slightly larger groups too, so that it regularly reminds you of what it is to live for Christ, and it points you in the direction of the kingdom, and it encourages you to help each other as you go along the road.
Roger, that's been so helpful, just to have this time to to think together about the structure that's provided, its flexibility and creativity, and just to reach out to those who are watching, to encourage them that, you know, maybe for the next 12 weeks, maybe for the next 2 or 3 months, try something new, try and be in one of these with these groups. And as a circuit, as a group of churches, we're going to try and facilitate that as much as we can. So there may be people from one church, or you may be willing to meet with a couple of people from another church. That can be actually quite helpful sometimes, to have somebody from a slightly different a different place. But you're going to return to us in a few weeks' time, and you're going to preach on a Sunday that's connected with learning and caring. We're really looking forward to that, Roger, and we're grateful for the time that you're giving to Chorley and Leyland Methodists with this.
Well, every blessing on what you're doing, and I look forward to preaching and being part of the worship in your circuit.
Thank you, Roger. Let me just stop recording.